大家好，
大家好。
又係讀你聽嘅時候你，咁我哋讀緊咩書啊？
遠大前程。
係啊，邊個作家寫㗎
Charles Dickens。
OK，Charles Dickens。OK，咁我而家讀到第23章啦。OK，咁啊，我哋今次第22次錄音，讀到第23章。咁我哋上回嘅故事發展到點呢？
上回咧就講到阿 pip 咧就同個 paleface喺度傾偈，之後去咗佢屋企，之後見到佢好多兄弟姊妹。
你係咪講完啊？你講完就話講完，我以為你諗緊。
講完啦。
OK，你要出聲，我唔知你講完啦。咁啊，其實仲發生咗好多嘢嘅嚇。咁佢有講到佢，其實佢有講到佢嗰個佢諗住做啲乜嘢啦。即係佢兩個諗住喺個城度做乜嘢啦？即係除咗帶佢去睇嘢之外，佢仲諗住介紹啲人俾佢識下咁樣嘅，係咪啊？咁仲有就係介紹嗰啲人物啦，仲有咩Foxon 啊、Millers 啊呢啲咁嘅人都係佢哋嘅係啦，即係呢啲咁嘅人啦。咁即係佢會講，即係呢一個 paleface 表面上係請工人階級嘅人，即係其實最起碼係中產啦。但係其實佢嘅屋其實都係掹緊嘅啫，因為佢住咗好多人所以其實都係好擠擁嘅。OK， 即係分分鐘佢喺阿 pip 鄉下住嘅地方，可能仲大添，都講唔埋。咁我哋而家繼續講啦。咁呢一章咧就應該就係會講呢一個 paleface 會帶阿 pip 周圍去啦，繼續啦。OK，Chapter 23。Mr. Pocket said he was glad to see me， 即係paleface 個爸爸啦。And he hoped I was not sorry to see him, for I really am not, he added, with his son's smile, an alarming personage. He was a young-looking man. In spite of his perplexities and his very grey hair, and his manners seemed quite natural. I use the word natural in the sense of its being unaffected. There was something comic in his distraught way, as though it would have been downright ludicrous but for his own perception that it was very near being so. When he had talked with me a little, he said to Mrs. Pocket, with a rather anxious contraction of his eyebrows, which were black and handsome, "Belinda, I hope you have welcomed Mr. Pip." And she looked up from her book and said, "Yes." She then smiled upon me in an absent state of mind and asked me if I liked the taste of orange flower water. As the question had no bearing, near or remote, on any foregone or subsequent transaction, I consider it to have been thrown out, like her previous approaches, in general conversational condescension. I found out within a few hours, and may mention at once, that Mrs. Pocket was the only daughter of a certain quite accidental deceased knight, who had invented for himself a conviction that his deceased father would have been made a baronet, but for somebody's determined opposition arising out of entirely personal motives, I forget whose, if I ever knew, the sovereigns, the prime ministers, the lord chancellors, the archbishop of Canterbury's, anybody's, and had tacked himself on to the nobles of the earth in right of this quite superstitious fact. I believe he had been knighted himself for storming the English grammar at the point of a pen, in a desperate address engrossed on vellum, on the occasion of the laying of the first stone of some building or other, and for handing some royal personage either the trowel or the mortar. But be that as it may, he had directed Mrs. Pocket to be brought up from her cradle as one who in the nature of things must marry a title, and who was to be guarded from the acquisition of plebeian domestic knowledge. 即係呢度呢一成段嘢就係講，即係 Mrs. Pocket 嗰種唔好嘅態度啦，然之後就數佢啦，就即刻喺度講佢嘅家底啊，就係話佢其實佢嘅家底其實佢所謂嘅呢啲咁嘅爵士嘅爵位得嚟都係成謎嘅，根本就夾硬嚟嘅，即係你呢啲咪假上流，即刻就其實就數落佢㗎啦，當然係喺文字上數落佢。So successful a watch and ward had been established over the young lady by this judicious parent that she had grown up highly ornamental but perfectly helpless and useless， 直情話佢冇用啦。 With her character thus happily formed, in the first bloom of her youth, she had encountered Mr. Pocket, who was also in the first bloom of youth, and not quite decided whether to mount to the woolsack or to roof himself in the mitre. As his doing the one or the other were a mere question of time, he and Mrs. Pocket had taken time by the forelock, and had married without the knowledge of the judicious parent. The judicious parent, having nothing to bestow or withhold but his blessing,
咩嚟㗎 judicious？
即係佢個法定嘅父母，但係佢冇講係爸爸定媽媽啦。Parent， 我諗係即係父母都有。Okay? Having nothing to bestow or withhold but his blessing, had handsomely settled that dower upon them after a short struggle, and had informed Mr. Pocket that his wife was a treasure for a prince. Mr. Pocket had invested the prince's treasure in the ways of the world ever since, and it was supposed to have brought him in, but in different interest. Still, Mrs. Pocket was in general the object of a queer sort of respectful pity, because she had not married a title, while Mr. Pocket was the object of a queer sort of forgiving reproach, because he had never got one. 即係其實佢兩個都期望得到一啲嘢，即係個 Mrs. Pocket 就想嫁俾一個有 title 嘅人，但係其實 Mr. Pocket 冇。Mr. Pocket 又想娶一個即係好身份好啊，性格好啊，脾氣好啊，點樣，即係亦都會幫到佢嘅一個人，但係亦都冇 Mrs. Pocket 係冇用嘅。咁但係其實阿 Pip 點解會知道咁多嘢咧？呢度係冇交代嘅。Pip just know。OK， 因為而家佢同阿 Paleface 嘅關係係絕對未去到佢會講晒父母嘅身世俾佢聽噶嘛。咁所以 Pip 點解而家呢一刻就會講咧？純粹就係因為 Charles Dickens 覺得我而家呢一刻就想數落呢兩個人咧，所以佢就唔交代點解阿 Pip 會知道咁多嘢。OK，so Pip just know。OK。Both Mr. and Mrs. Pocket had such a noticeable air of being in somebody else's hands that I wondered who really was in possession of the house and let them live there. 即係話佢兩個關係都幾緊張啦。Until I found this unknown power to be the servants. It was a smooth way of going on, perhaps in respect of saving trouble, but it had the appearance of being expensive, for the servants felt it a duty they owed to themselves to be nice in their eating and drinking and to keep a deal of company downstairs. They allowed a very liberal table to Mr. and Mrs. Pocket, yet it always appeared to me that by far the best part of the house to have boarded in would have been the kitchen, always supposing the boarder capable of self-defense, for before I had been there a week, a neighboring lady with whom the family were personally unacquainted wrote in to say that she had seen Millis slapping the baby. This greatly distressed Mrs. Pocket, who burst into tears on receiving the note and said that it was an extraordinary thing that the neighbours couldn't mind their own business. 咁恐怖嘅，即係話個工人有打 BB 喎。By degrees I learnt, and chiefly from Herbert, that Mr. Pocket had been educated at Harrow and at Cambridge, where he had distinguished himself, but that when he had had the happiness of marrying Mrs. Pocket very early in life, he had impaired his prospects and taken up the calling of a grinder. After grinding a number of dull blades, of whom it was remarkable that their fathers, when influential, were always going to help him to pre-ferment, but always forgot to do it when the blades and left the grindstone, he had wearied of that poor work and had come to London. Here, after gradually failing in loftier hopes, he had read with divers who had lacked opportunities or neglected them, and had refurbished divers others for special occasions, and had turned his acquirements to the account of literary compilation and correction, and on such means added to some very moderate private resources, still maintained the house I saw. 佢呢一個章節寫啲句子全部好長，比較難明。Mr. and Mrs. Pocket had a toady neighbour, a widow lady of that highly sympathetic nature that she agreed with everybody, blessed everybody, and shed smiles and tears on everybody, according to circumstances. This lady's name was Mrs. Coiler, and I had the honour of taking her down to dinner on the day of my installation. She gave me to understand on the stairs that it was a blow to dear Mrs. Pocket that dear Mr. Pocket should be under the necessity of receiving gentlemen to read with him, That did not extend to me. She told me in a gush of love and confidence, if they were all like me, it would be quite another thing. But dear Mrs. Pocket, said Mr. Coiler, after her early disappointment requires so much luxury and elegance. Yes, ma'am, I said to stop her, for I was afraid she was going to cry. And she is of so aristocratic a disposition. Yes, ma'am, I said again, with the same object as before. That it is hard, said Mrs. Coiler, to have dear Mr. Pocket's time and attention diverted from dear Mrs. Pocket. I could not help thinking that it might be harder if the butcher's time and attention were diverted from dear Mrs. Pocket, but I said nothing, and indeed had nothing to do in keeping a bashful watch upon my company's manners. It came to my knowledge through what passed between Mrs. Pocket and Drummle while I was attentive to my knife and fork, spoon, glasses, and other instruments of self-destruction, that Drummle, whose Christian name was Bentley, was actually the next heir but one to a baronetcy. It further appeared that the book I had seen Mrs. Pocket reading in the garden was all about titles, and that she knew the exact date at which her grandpapa would have come into the book, if he ever had come at all. Drummle didn't say much, but in his limited way he spoke as one of the elect, and recognized Mrs. Pocket as a woman and a sister. No one but themselves and Mrs. Coiler, the toady neighbor, showed any interest in this part of the conversation, and it appeared to me that it was painful to Herbert. But it promised to last a long time, when the page came in with the announcement of a domestic affliction. It was in the fact that the cook had mislaid the beef. To my unutterable amazement, I now, for the first time, saw Mr. Pocket relieve his mind by going through a performance that struck me as very extraordinary, but which made no impression on anybody else, and with which I soon became as familiar as the rest. He laid down the carving knife and fork, and being engaged in carving at the moment, put his two hands into his disturbed hair, and appeared to make an extraordinary effort to lift himself up by it. When he had done this, and had not lifted himself up at all, he quietly went on with what he was about. Mrs. Coiler then changed the subject and began to flatter me. I liked it for a few moments, but she flattered me so very grossly that the pleasure was soon over. She had a serpentine way of coming close at me when she pretended to be vitally interested in the friends and localities I had left, which was altogether snaky and fork-tongued. 即係形容佢係條蛇咁啦。And when she made an occasional bounce upon Startup or upon Drummle, I rather envied them for being on the opposite side of the table. 即係話呢個 Mrs. Coiler 啦，即係 Pocket 嘅鄰居啦，即係非常之嘅八卦啦，亦都係趨炎附勢啦，即係咁喺度掹佢車邊啦，即係佢已經覺得好反感啦。After dinner, the children were introduced, and Mrs. Coiler made admiring comments on their eyes, noses, and legs, and a sagacious way of improving their minds. There were 4 little girls and 2 little boys, besides the baby, who might have been either, and the baby's next successor, who was as yet neither. They were brought in by Flopson and Millers, much as though those 2 non-commissioned officers had been recruiting somewhere for children and had enlisted these, while Mrs. Pocket looked at the young nobles that ought to have been as if she rather thought she had had the pleasure of inspecting them before, but didn't quite know what to make of them. 哇！佢真係寫到好長，但係佢真係扼晒落去咯，同埋佢一句講晒，佢連 comma 都費事。Here, give me your fork, Mum, and take the baby, said Flopson. Don't take it that way, or you'll get its head under the table. Thus advised, Mrs. Pocket took it the other way, and got its head upon the table, which was announced to all present by a prodigious concussion. Dear, dear, give it me back, Mum, said Flopson, and Miss Jane, come and dance to baby do. One of the little girls, a mere mite who seemed to have prematurely taken upon herself some charge of the others, stepped out of her place by me, and danced to and from the baby until it left off crying and laughed. Then all the children laughed, and Mr. Pocket laughed, and we all laughed and were glad. Flopson, by dint of doubling the baby at the joints like a Dutch doll, then got it safely into Mrs. Pocket's lap, and gave it the nutcrackers to play with. at the same time recommending Mrs. Pocket to take notice that the handles of that instrument were not likely to agree with its eyes, and sharply changing Miss Jane to look after the same. Then the two nurses left the room and had a lively scuffle on the staircase with a dissipated page who had waited at dinner and who had clearly lost half his buttons at a gaming table. I was made very uneasy in my mind by Mrs. Pocket's falling into a discussion with Drummle respecting two baronetcies.
咩㗎？
baronetcies 即係 baronetcy 啊 baronetcy 即係兩個可以得到爵位嘅人 ，OK， 兩個將會得到爵位嘅人。While she ate the sliced orange baron 即係嗰個爵，即係其中即係公侯伯子男其中之一個級數，我唔知係邊個級啦 baron。While she ate a sliced orange steeped in sugar and wine, and forgetting all about the baby on her lap, who did most appalling things with the nutcrackers. At length, little Jane, perceiving its young brains to be imperiled, softly left her place, and with many small artifices coaxed the dangerous weapon away. Mrs. Pocket, finishing her orange at about the same time, and not approving of this, said to Jane, "You naughty child, how dare you? Go and sit down this instant." "Mamma dear," lisped the little girl, "baby would have put Eve eye out." "How dare you tell me so?" retorted Mrs. Pocket. "Go and sit down in your chair this moment." Mrs. Pocket's dignity was so crushing that I felt quite abashed, as if myself had done something to rouse it. "Belinda," remonstrated Mr. Pocket from the other end of the table, "how can you be so unreasonable? Jane only interfered for the protection of baby." "I will not allow anybody to interfere," said Mrs. Pocket. "I am surprised, Matthew, that you should expose me to the affront of interference." "Good God!" cried Mr. Pocket, in an outbreak of desolate desperation. "Are infants to be nutcracked into their tombs, and is nobody to save them?" "I will not be interfered with by Jane," said Mrs. Pocket, with a majestic glance at that innocent little offender. "I hope I know my poor grandpapa's position. Jane, indeed." 即係又搬佢個又搬佢阿公或者阿爺出嚟講啊，因為呢個阿公阿爺係有爵位㗎嘛呢個爵位係有 inverted commas 㗎。Mr. Pocket got his hands in his hair again, and this time really did lift himself some inches out of his chair. "Hear this," he helplessly exclaimed to the elements. "Babies are to be nutcracked dead for people's poor grandpapa's positions." Then he let himself down again and became silent. We all looked awkwardly at the tablecloth while this was going on. A pause succeeded, during which the honest and irrepressible baby made a series of leaps and crows at little Jane, who appeared to me to be the only member of the family with whom it had any decided acquaintance. "Mr. Drummle," said Mrs. Pocket, "will you ring for Flopson? Jane, you undutiful little thing, go and lie down. Now, baby darling, come with Ma." The baby was the soul of honor, and protested with all its might. It doubled itself up the wrong way over Mrs. Pocket's arm, exhibited a pair of knitted shoes and dimpled ankles to the company in lieu of its soft face, and was carried out on the highest state of mutiny. And it gained its point after all, for I saw it through the window within a few minutes, being nursed by little Jane. It happened that the other 5 children were left behind at the dinner table, through Flopson's having some private engagement, and their not being anybody else's business. I thus became aware of the mutual relations between them and Mr. Pocket, which were exemplified in the following manner. Mr. Pocket, with the normal perplexity of his face heightened with his hair rumpled, looked at them for some minutes as if he couldn't make out how they came to be boarding and lodging in that establishment, and why they hadn't been billeted by nature on somebody else. Then, in a distant missionary way, he asked them certain questions, as why little Joe had that hole in his frill, who said, "Pa, Flopson was going to mend it when she had time," and how little Fanny came by that whitlow, who said, "Pa, Miller's was going to poultice it when she didn't forget." Then he melted into parental tenderness, and gave them a shilling apiece and told them to go and play. And then, as they went out, with one very strong effort to lift himself up by the chair, he dismissed the hopeless subject. 即係呢度似乎係好似講緊，即係呢度除咗個 BB 之外，即係其他細路嗰個待遇好似好一般喎，好似冇乜人理佢哋啊。咁啊爸爸好心理佢哋，咁都係求其掉啲錢俾佢啊！你件衫啊，或者你啲咩穿咗窿啊，自己補翻啊，咁好自己搞掂啊。In the evening, there was rowing on the river. As Drummle and Startup had each a boat, I resolved to set up mine and to cut them both out. I was pretty good at most exercises in which country boys are adepts, but as I was conscious of wanting elegance of style for the Thames, not to say for other waters, I at once engaged to place myself under the tuition of the winner of a prize wherry who plied at our stairs and to whom I was introduced by my new allies. This practical authority confused me very much by saying I had the arm of a blacksmith. If he could have known how nearly the compliment lost him as his pupil, I doubt if he would have paid it. There was a supper tray after we got home at night, and I think we should all have enjoyed ourselves, but for a rather disagreeable domestic occurrence. Mr. Pocket was in good spirits when a housemaid came in and said, "If you please, sir, I should wish to speak to you." "Speak to your master," said Mr. Pocket, whose dignity was roused again. "How can you think of such a thing? Go and speak to Flopson, or speak to me at some other time." 即係佢都係 Mrs. Pocket 都係啲好 proud 嘅人啦。"Begging your pardon, ma'am," returned the housemaid, "I should wish to speak at once, and to speak to master." Hereupon, Mr. Pocket went out of the room, and we made the best of ourselves until he came back. "This is a pretty thing, Belinda," said Mr. Pocket, returning with the countenance expressive of grief and despair. "Here's the cook lying insensibly drunk on the kitchen floor, with a large bundle of fresh butter made up in a cupboard ready to sell for grease." Mrs. Pocket instantly showed much amiable emotion, and said, "This is that odious Sophia's doing." "What do you mean, Belinda?" demanded Mr. Pocket. "Sophia has told you," said Mrs. Pocket. Did I not see her with my own eyes and hear her with my own ears come into the room just now and ask to speak to you?" "But has she not taken me downstairs, Belinda," returned Mr. Pocket, "and shown me the woman, and the bundle too?" "And do you defend her, Matthew," said Mrs. Pocket, "for making mischief?" Mr. Pocket uttered a dismal groan. "Am I grandpapa's granddaughter, to be nothing in the house?" said Mrs. Pocket. 又搬佢阿公阿爺出嚟。"Besides, the cook has always been a very nice, respectful woman, and said in the most natural manner when she came to look for after the situation, that she felt I was born to be a duchess." There was a sofa where Mr. Pocket stood, and he dropped upon it in the attitude of the dying gladiator. Still in that attitude, he said with a hollow voice, "Good night, Mr. Pip," when I deemed it advisable to go to bed and leave him. 即係 Mr. Pocket 都對於佢老婆嘅態度啊，即係喐啲就搬佢嗰啲爵位出嚟講啊，喐啲就搬啲階級出嚟講嚟壓佢咧，佢都有氣無力，亦都唔想再爭辯啦。咁啊，直接就Pip 你去瞓啦。OK。咁其實呢一節其實係講咩？呢節其實就係講 Mrs. Pocket， 其實就係數落佢，即係講佢有幾乞人憎啦，即係幾渴求自己有爵位，但係其實佢冇啦。另一方面就係另一個可能佢認為Pip 認為更乞人憎嘅就係佢哋嘅 neighbour 啦，嗰個Coiler 啦，又係好見高拜見低踩嘅人啦。咁相對 Mr. Pocket 咧就好啲嘅咁但係其實佢都有問題，因為佢其實根本就冇咁多錢生咁多細路，但係佢又走去生咁多，然之後又唔識湊細路，又唔識點照顧佢哋，所以其實有啲鬧交啊！呢個 Pocket 呢個 family 咁仲要請2個工人，咁然之後嗰個 cook 又咁樣，即係又做嘢又咁。冇嚟搭霎即係其實佢哋，即係其實我諗，即係意味住佢哋一家其實嗰個好多 domestic problem 咯，同埋就係 Mrs. Pocket 亦都係冇打理屋企嘅一個人嚟。佢因為佢要請2個工人打理啦嘛，仲要請多個 cook，但係 咁樣醉咗咁樣坐喺度，然之後 Mr. Pocket 去處理 Mrs. Pocket 都要去話佢嘅，即係説明咗啲咩？説明咗即係 dysfunctional family 咯，甚至乎香港。所以呢個 pale face 可以做到照顧到自己，都一個幾 upright 嘅 gentleman， 同埋好 delightful 咧，其實即係好好㗎啦。咁同埋就係係咯，即係咁當然啦，屋企又唔係真係冇錢，屋企有錢，咁佢都俾佢供書教學，即係都令到呢個 pale face 知道佢要喺上流社會度立足。但係阿 Pip 亦都一早預言咗呢一個 pale face 即係 Herbert， 其實佢個人根本就唔夠啊，唔夠擦鞋仔啊，唔夠搏啊，佢真係想做翻自己啫。Herbert 真係只係想做翻自己啫，咁啫。咁所以喺呢一個階段咧，佢同阿 Pip 咧係夾嘅。但係遲啲阿 Pip 繼續咁想上樓上嘅時候咧，佢可能分分鐘終於一日都會同 Herbert 唔啱傾。佢過咗 Herbert，即係佢嘅眼光又好，佢思想又好，終於可能都會超越咗 Herbert， 都唔出奇。又或者佢會唔會我想Herbert 同我一樣一齊上樓咧，亦都有可能嘅。但係如果照住而家咁樣，大家呢個狀態繼續成長落去咧 ，Herbert 可能真係會保持住而家呢個心態。咁佢上樓嘅機會就係好一般嘅啫，因為佢成日都講真話嘅。但係阿 Pip 就唔係啦，阿 Pip 乜都做得出。你想點？你想騎我都得。記得佢同 Miss Havisham 嗰個關係，或者佢對住 Estella 嗰種鵪鶉啊，佢咩都做得出。咁所以佢兩個可能到最後都係會分道揚鑣，或者唔需要去到最後，可能去到呢一章最尾，可能兩個會 split 都唔出奇。不過呢一章唔係講佢兩個，唔係講呢兩兄弟關係，呢章係講 Mrs. Pocket， 講佢鄰居 Mrs. Coyle， 兩個都係乞人憎嘅。OK， 起碼而家阿 Pip 覺得佢哋乞人憎。OK， 就係咁先啦。有冇問題？
冇啦。
好，咁我下次繼續講落去啦。OK，拜拜。